Okay, thank you all for coming to this seminar today. Ariane Agunsoye is member of HYPE, as a matter of fact, external member of the History and Political Economy Finance cluster. She's lecturer in economics in the Institute of Management Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. But we all know Ariane here. I first saw Ariane's name in a PhD application back in 2014, and if I remember correctly, Ariane, if not, please say so. The project on the paper then was about financial instability, the welfare state, with some emphasis on Minsky. But since then, there's been a lot of water under the bridge. Ariane was an exceptional PhD student, and now she is a very strong researcher with interest on the impact of financialization on everyday life. And in particular, her research is looking into interdisciplinary approaches in studying financialization, combining social theory, finance, cultural, and political economy. I suspect this is a mix that we will see in the presentation today. So the floor is yours, Ariane. And
okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And yes, today I would like to talk about a project I'm working on right now with a colleague of mine and friend who is Dr. Hayley Janes. So she's working at the University College of Dublin. And basically, what we're trying to do is figure out how individuals think about the pressure to accumulate assets within the UK. So that's what you can see in the title as well. And a particular focus in this case, I would like to pay on how they deal with not only the inherent uncertainty of financial and pension investments, but also how they deal with any forms of constraints in this case. And just, as a word of caution in this case, it's we just started to work on this project. We have some working papers on it, but it's by no means finished. So I really look forward to gain your insights and comments and discuss it afterwards. Okay, so just to give you a brief overview of what I would like to discuss today. So first, I'm going to just give an overview of what the motivation was concerning this research based on the contextual background of the UK, but also the kind of literature discussion which we draw in this project a little bit on, and we took as a reference point to start the exploration in this case. And then I introduced the research methodology. So here I go a little bit more into depth. The two research studies we actually combine here. So both of us have conducted interviews during 2016 and 17, and we realized that our insights are quite similar. So therefore we combined the insights we gained from that. And then I basically will go into a particular focus on pension planning. So here I will start with looking at how individuals perceive pensions, how they perceive the uncertainty in this case, and then also look at how financial investment are, how they are perceived with regards to the future. And this will help hopefully then later on in the other three parts as well to explain a little bit how the individuals interact. So this is structured into three different strategies basically. So here I will focus first on any form of structure constraints people might experience, such as, for instance, employment breaks because of caring, and then through that having a different pension contributions than others. And I will focus on normative constraints, so particularly looking at what kind of norms exist in society which might constrain our behavior with regards to the pension planning. And the uniqueness, or hopefully the uniqueness in this case, is to look at not just what constraints we experience or might experience, but also how the individuals react to it and try to find their own approaches how to deal with that. And then the third strategy looks a little bit more at how they actively try to deal with the uncertainty outside necessarily the expectation of the pension investment and the underlying reasoning for that. So those are the three levels, which you could see also as kind of different degrees of trying to gain control over their financial future in this case. And then I'm going to provide a very preliminary conclusion where we are at the moment, what we're trying to see, or how we're trying to conceptualize that within the wider frame of the literature we have drawn on before. So just to give you a context where basically the presentation and the exploration generally focuses on. This relates back to key concepts introduced in the everyday financialization literature, but also in the literature from sociology, which deals with pension planning. And basically here the focus is on particular welfare system where we have the asset-based welfare approach, meaning that the provision by the state has been continuously reduced, and basically the individual is now responsible to provide financial security in the future and to basically create sufficient asset or accumulate sufficient assets throughout their lifetime and working life so they can draw upon the income from these assets or by selling the assets later on. And this has been discussed in the everyday financialization literature as that we can see or experience here an increasing construction of the everyday investor. That entails actually two perspectives. So here it's assumed that everyone would accumulate assets over the lifetime, and here particularly with a strong focus on financial investments such as stocks and shares, and having a very diversified portfolio in this case. So the literature particularly looks at how discourses are also created, that it shouldn't be just passive engagement with financial products, but active engagement with financial products. So that presumably goes above having savings, but actually developing a very diversified portfolio. And also another element of that is, besides accumulate the asset, is that you would adopt financial strategies, you would actively monitor the investment which are conducted, and the expectation here is that the everyday investor enjoys also doing that because they gain more responsibility through that. So that's basically the key underlying assumption, which you can see in a lot of reconstruction from the welfare state on also the policies which have been introduced within the UK. And in this particular instance, I would like to just very briefly, I'm sure most of you know the system, but for the ones who don't, very briefly introduce the three elements of the expectation concerning pensions within the UK. So the UK is basically based on 3 tiers. So we have a state pension, which is mainly just there to provide poverty relief. So that's not something where you would be expected to rely on predominantly later on. Also, it's quite limited in the case that you will have to have national insurance contribution over 35 years and depending on being employed continuously throughout. So this is basically the basic, and there you can already see in comparison to other countries, it's one of the lowest state pension provisions amongst OECD countries. Now, the key aspect or idea is that since we're supposed to become everyday investors, we would actually then provide security through the workplace pension or private pension contribution. So those are the other two elements. The workplace pension has changed tremendously throughout the years. So it has moved from a relatively secure system where a lot of people had access to a system where it's now mainly based on defined contribution, meaning that you don't have a secured income anymore based on the pension contributions you conducted, but it's actually based on the various contribute and how they're invested. So kind of you can see a risk shift from the employer towards the employee. And also what happened here is that up until 2012, it was recognized that a lot of employers stopped offering workplace pension or people would not contribute. So that's basically where we then had the introduction of automatic enrollment. And here again, with the criteria of working in one place of work at least earning £10,000. So the third level then is, in addition to that, that you actually accumulate financial assets yourself. So you build your portfolio of financial market assets, invest in stocks and shares. And here, going back to the asset-based welfare aspect, that is supported by the state. So here you would have tax incentives, such as in the self-invested personal pension, or you would have government subsidies, such as in the lifetime ISA, where you're supposed to save over time, and they actually the government contributes to that. So kind of inducing everyone to conform to this identity of the everyday investor. And nevertheless, even after the workplace pension introduction, we still experience in the UK under saving and also under investment, as you can see down below. So now there have been several explanations basically put forward to, on the one hand, explain the under saving in the case of workplace pension, but also in the case of not actively managing the pension investment or financial investment. And I just wanted to highlight here two main perspectives. One relates back to the behavioral economics direction, actually, and bounded rationality, where a lot of insights from behavioral economics are not or have been implemented in policy direction as well, where the assumption is that we are limited in how we can actually calculate future income. So we cannot become this rational everyday investor who can calculate everything up front and knows exactly what they're supposed to do or supposed to accumulate throughout their lifetime in order to have sufficient retirement income. We're also limited by the information we can collect, and therefore we employed shortcuts. So one key aspect which has been discussed in this case is the present bias, that we subconsciously just focus more on the present than the future in this case. And here in particular, within the discussion of bounded rationality, the key idea is to find policies to correct basically this wrong decision. So it's seen as a deviation from the expected behavior, and we need to correct it. And another perspective which is introduced here is procedural rationality, or also referred to as fast and frugal heuristics, where it is actually recognized, okay, we can have heuristics depending on the complexity of the environment, which help us to make decisions without actually harming any wider or being a systemic issue. So here, if the environment is not too complex, it's normal for us to use shortcuts and not to process every single different information. Now, the question is then really how far this can be applicable with regards to pension decisions, as long-term pension decisions are quite complex. Now, within the financialization of daily life literature, uncertainty has also been discussed, and here, particularly from the perspective that it's recognized that there is an issue inherent in this identity of the everyday investor. So there are contradictions inherent in there. So we are, for instance, living in a society where we increasingly have an insecure work environment, which we can see now during the pandemic again. We are in a society where the financial and pension investments are never or cannot be considered secure because there's just inherent uncertainty constructed within. So even if we do, or the people do everything they're expected to, there remains an uncertainty of their investment. So here it's recognized that there are some contradictions. When we don't have security in the workplace, we might not be able to contribute continuously throughout. Or if we invest in financial investment and then still have insecurity, people might not want to invest in as they're supposed to. And the third conflict is basically relating to the consumer behavior. So looking at how we are at the same time constructed or supposed to behave as an everyday investor, but also consume and use their products for the consumption. So that stands in conflict as well. So those are what I just wanted to highlight. Those are the key discussions concerning, or as arguments put forward, why people are not behaving according to the theoretical explanations. Now, what this doesn't integrate actively yet is why, for instance, the women's pension wealth is different than men's, why we have pension differences and the ethnicity pension gap in this case. So just recently it was published, I think it was by Scottish widows. A study was published where they estimated it would take for women to close the pension gap, it would take up to 37 years of extra work to actually have the pension gap closed down. So, of course, that's a huge issue then, and has been picked up in more, as Dimitris mentioned, my approach tends to be more interdisciplinary. So it has been picked up in other literature as well, and mainly from sociology. And how I structured it a bit here is concerning the structural constraints and normative constraints, meaning that we have systemic constraints in this case based on, for instance, that the pension system is largely or has been built largely around an aspect or assumption that we have a mere life trajectory and we have continuous employment and we have a continuous career progression, etc. So those are structures built in with the pension system where they're not necessarily directly influenced by normative constraints in this case, whereas normative constraints relate more back to direct impact on us, how we might internalize also norms expected from us. So within the structural constraints, you can see that we have an income gap. There have been discussions also within heterodox economics concerning how financial products are offered differently depending on the identity. So it has been recognized within, for instance, the heterodox and stratification economics that financial products have been offered with higher interest rates to people from minority ethnic backgrounds up until the run-up to the global financial crisis in this case. Another discussion, as I mentioned, is relating to the underlying assumption in the pension system. And then the third one is relating to, which moves now further into what happens if we have or deal with intersectionality. So recognizing that we don't have a clear identity either or always, but we actually have interrelating identities. Normative constraints then looks at how, on the one hand, gender norms construct who is taking over the care role, but also what it means if we internalize gender norms concerning financial behavior. So here it has been shown, Joseph, for instance, shows in her study how personal finance literature has been constructed with an underlying assumption of masculinity, an underlying assumption of risk behavior, etc. Whereas in contrast to that, women have been constructed as the paralyzed non-investors or shopaholics. So here, these norms, if they're internalized by the individuals, then of course they have an impact on our strategy. So those are two main literature strands, which I'm going to go back later on. And what we basically want to explore now is how individuals deal with these constraints, but also how they deal with the uncertainty, basically. So for this purpose, I start with in the empirical data, then with the uncertainty discussion. So just very briefly, the two studies I'm drawing onto is one which is relating to interviews conducted in 2016 and 17, which were mainly conducted with the purpose of exploring how individuals collect or accumulate assets. And those were recruited through different mechanisms, such as advertisements, local events, etc. And as you can see here, there is a quite large range of age differences. The second study was conducted as well in 2016 and 17. And here we also have a similar dispersion of female and male interviewees. And they were mainly interviewed based through having access to companies in the fashion, hospitality, and finance industry and talking to people there. And again, those two studies, what we realized that our insights, our approach to the studies, but also insights are quite similar. So we actually combined the insights and the discussion points here. So let's start with the perception of uncertainty. So what's interesting in the interview statements that they pick up this inherent uncertainty of not only pension but financial investment. They feel a strong uncertainty concerning that there have been a lot of pension scandals. They don't know if what they contribute now in the future will still be there in the case of workplace pension, because there have been a lot of changes. they don't know if the amount actually will be enough in the end. So one striking statement here, so for instance, by Carly is all of a sudden they say, okay, oh, sorry, all those contributions are void. So there's a strong fear there that they contribute over a long time period, but then actually don't get the value they're supposed to get. And I will pick up on that in one of the strategies, which actually determines one of the approaches then. A similar aspect in particular in relating to discussions of the global financial crisis is that there's hardly any trust anymore in financial investment, that there's a perception there that the persons or the people in the financial industry will look out for themselves, will make their own profit. You cannot just trust them. And especially if you're investing money which you worked hard for, you need to make sure that you invest it or save in a way where you don't lose it. So two elements are very essential here, which is the uncertainty where you never know if you're actually going to get the value in the future, but also the huge distrust in the whole system through the different changes, which relate back to the pension system, which I briefly introduced before. But nevertheless, all interview participants mentioned that they feel the strong need to provide for themselves, that they know they need to provide for themselves, that they have this responsibility because you don't have job security anymore. So you don't, whereas before you could actually rely on a job. Right now, in general, there's a high job insecurity. And therefore, you need to provide to a certain degree by yourself. And this means you need to find mechanisms to do that. And I will look at now how they do it within structural constraints first. So what you can see here is that one key element which was picked up by interviews is that, which basically was expected by the literature or discussed in the literature before, that they have constraints based on caring duties, so mainly childcare duties. And this is relating to two elements. So one is the maternity period, but also then the period where you still need to provide childcare up until the children then go into publicly provided childcare. And this impacts actually how they deal with the pensions. So in the case of the workplace pension and being right before maternity leave or being during maternity leave, the emphasis is placed on that they would have liked to stay within their system, that they would have liked to contribute, but there was not just enough flexibility. So they couldn't just reduce the amount, at least, of or felt they couldn't reduce the amount they contributed. They couldn't pause it just for a few weeks or months, etc., whatever they needed in this moment. And so on the one hand, they felt they didn't have enough flexibility, so they stopped contributing in this case. Or they decided not contributing in the first instance because, as you can see in the statement by Leanne, it's basically that they saw or assumed that their income during this time would be too low, so it wouldn't necessarily be possible. Now, this is during the maternity period. Now you also have the discussion concerning what happens if you need to provide for childcare duties. And the striking part with the UK is that basically childcare duties are comparatively seen very high. So it's, I think, the second highest within OECD countries, and around about 36% of average income of two income earners if you have two children, compared to 15% to OECD levels. So it's really high in this case. And that's one key argument which is actually taken to drop out of the job and actually making it really, or having a discussion beforehand what to do in this case, how to do, and also making a decision then to drop out of the workplace pension in this case. So you can see here two statements relating to that. So one was about having to leave the work overall, and the other one is relating to having to leave the workplace pension because of the high childcare costs. So in both instances, it's interesting because they emphasize, these interview participants emphasize that they would like to contribute, that they would like to provide for themselves through pension using the free employer money, but they felt the need they needed to drop out and didn't have choice. Now, what they tried to do then, in order to kind of circumvent a little bit the period when they're affected by the caring role, is they, interesting enough, they try to increase the pension contributions beforehand, or have on the side a more flexible product where they can reduce based on maternity leave or caring duties, etc. So it's interesting that they try to actively provide a solution to that. And a lot of cases we heard in the interview statements, or seen in the interview statements, that they felt the need, they wanted to provide financial security, not so, for instance, one regard of the literature is that women often don't plan accordingly ahead, etc. But here it's actually a conscious decision. They want to do it, but they are limited by the system in itself. And a similar thing can be seen that in this case, you will have then often reduced earnings possibilities in the future, because career progression is differently than compared to men, as you can see in the statement here. You have to again still have certain caring duties, etc., and often go back then to a non-traditional male employment cycle. In addition to that, if you or the interview participants experience then also income constraint because of being the single income earner, this was intensified because they basically emphasize again that they tried the best, but they couldn't just, first of all, they didn't have access either to workforce pension, or their income was too low, and then they tried to save themselves, but then struggled because of these income constraints. So in both cases, they tried to actively find solutions to this, to these constraints, but cannot see a way out really actively out of that. So what you then have is that you basically come into a kind of frustrated position. So where you would, or you have persons who want to save and then they cannot through structural arrangements. So you have then the case that they try to find ways where they somehow gain control in their future financial security again. So what you can see is they focus on having control, having flexibility, as I mentioned before, with the flexible investment product, but also making sure that they can access the money. And I will come back to this in the next phase. But the whole perspective here is wanting to gain control and gaining flexibility, or having flexibility in their investment. Now, when you look at the normative constraints, so besides how the system is constructed, we also have experienced or seen that there are expectations how people are behaving. So, for instance, in one case, you have experienced family constraints where you're expected to send money back home in case there is family emergency, for instance. So in this case, especially if it intervenes with income constraints, then they have to take on a loan, but that's not taken lightly, and that's not taken as, in the literature, it's often constructed as for financing a nice lifestyle, but it's actually because they don't have any other choice and need to do that because of the constraints. However, they then, as you can see in the statement below, they focus on not having to do that and actually providing more security through savings. A similar thing you can see with the gender norms. So there are norms, what I mentioned before with the caring, where basically there are expectations there concerning who is taking over the main caring role. And that recently it has been shown in another study that this is even more predominantly women, but even the case when women earn more or are the main breadwinner. So that, as you've seen before with the structural constraints, of course, hinders certain decisions, but also what happens here is then it even affects who is contributing to further caring roles. So here it reduces the amount of time you actually can have, and also the discussion around who is paying for the childcare is predominantly lying on the women we interviewed. So it's not a discussion if the man is actually sacrificing the income, but actually the women have negotiated that for themselves. And this also translates not to just to childcare, but they are also carrying duties concerning if you have to take care of elderly parents or family members. So what happens here is then that they try to, again, find more flexible or accessible ways of saving and planning ahead. So what you have then, as you can see in the statements with the children, they try to find products which are more accessible, which are not locked away for such a long time in case they need to access it, in case there are income constraints, in case they need money for emergencies, so that they don't have to take on debt in this case. And you see here also cultural aspects playing a role, how you actually invest the money. So in both cases, it's kind of trying to find a way surrounding the constraints which gives you more flexibility rather than not planning ahead or then not thinking ahead. And also with the normative constraints, what I wanted to pick up here is, I mentioned before, a lot of times it's seen that or constructed as women are less financially inclined, or they don't like to take on risk as much, etc. Interesting enough, in the case of the interviews, they picked this discussion up in order to justify why they just take on the mandatory contributions from the workplace pension without looking at how it's invested or what are the options. So basically reducing their time investment. And the main discussion was around, it's just too complex, and they wouldn't understand it basically. So picking up this construction of women being less financially inclined. But on the other hand, you have the quite logical justification actually in this case, where they argue the pensions are just too far away. They're not just uncertain, but they don't have enough control over it. So it's basically, it's locked away. It goes away from your money before actually coming to your bank account. You cannot access as easily as your bank account to see how the value goes up and down, to adjust the investment, to basically to be flexible in this case again. So here, as you can see in the statement, it's basically put forward that they're not in control of it. And it's interesting, if you look at the statement on the top by Lauren, they state there, okay, it's probably gives me more fear being in a pension scheme, because you're thinking, I will be 27 next year, contribute 11 years of my life, and I actually might never see this money or benefit from it. So again, this constant uncertainty underlying it, but also feeling that there's no control over how you can approach that. So a lot of times it's mentioned it would be good if they would have just an easily app on the phone where they can do it in a similar way and check in a similar way as with bank accounts in this case. So they expressed actually through those two elements a sense of detachment, and therefore reduced their time investment in the pensions overall. So what happens then is that they try to make sure, or try to benefit from the free money from the employer. So that's a very, so the main approach is to really make sure that you don't lose on the employer's money, even increasing the contributions before you're having children, as I mentioned before, but not actually actively engaging. So you could argue that this is a quite logical reaction to the systemic constraints and normative constraints, because even if you invest more time, it's not even sure that in the future you will not be constrained through having children, or that the investments will turn out as you expected. So this is basically the key element here, as well as, again, trying to find a flexible approach overall. Now, the last strategy, whereas the first ones were kind of moving in between the system and trying to find ways to cope with the current aspects. The last part deals more with trying to find other ways to invest to gain more control. And here, continuous reference was made to have an investment which provides you more control. So here in this case, which helps you also to deal with a very different employment structure than expected by the overall system in itself. So where you have more flexibility again and more accessibility earlier in this case. So what's put forward here is safety. In this case, you can see premium bonds are, for instance, chosen, or managed investment products, where basically they would have access in 3 to 5 years, and that gives them more a sense of control, a sense of being able to access in case something changes, but also contributing towards this saving for the long term. And that's again goes back to that pensions are often seen as a black hole where you don't feel like or know where the money is going to. And the other part is that they also emphasize the desire to invest in the property or house before focusing more on pensions or long-term investment. And that's mainly done because it seems like if something happens in your employment, if something happens in the future, you can react more flexibly. You could even rent out a room, or you could use it in different ways. Also, there's, as I'm sure most of you know, there's this discourse, you can find this again, that houses in this case, you not just have the tangible asset, but you also expect housing prices to always to pay itself off or go up over the long term. So here the property is perceived as a solution to this approach and finding a longer term solution, and also something where you have more control. And interesting enough, compared to what I mentioned before with the workplace pension, here actually active advice from other persons are taken, how they, for instance, what other financial investment they're having, even financial advisors in some cases are taken on, or friends are and families are consulted to see how they can, what kind of approach they can take. So here you can see a little bit more active approach to that in comparison to reducing the time investment within the pension. So overall, you can see the focus on that they want to provide financial security, that they want to be safe. However, it's not as theoretically expected according to the everyday investor, but actually focusing on having some assets which appear controllable and making sure that you can deal with income changes during your lifetime, make sure that you can adjust the strategy throughout your lifetime in case something else happens. And this is basically what you could see in the statement is, again, that the first emphasis was on having flexibility through savings and accessible savings, and then going towards the property. And once this is secured, then thinking more about the pension, because the pension is appears to be the more uncertain and less flexible approach. And just very briefly, two different dimensions you can find here actually. One is that they go in a further direction into not just later on focusing on pension, but because of the uncertainty of pension, they actually then focus on buy-to-let properties, whereas others argue against it and then go more into the financial aspect. So this is not a strategy which, of course, fits to everyone, but what I wanted to show you that there is an active strategy or approach how to deal with the situation, how to make sure in the future to provide financial security. And this relates also back to, in the case of not believing in tying oneself down through property investment, but nevertheless not wanting to just pay rent to someone else and then not benefiting, where basically flexibility is presumably kept through shared ownership, where they can then flexibly move somewhere else, move around, go somewhere else. Whereas if you have the property completely by yourself, that's not possible. And another aspect here is you can see that this helps also with the income constraint level. Now, the summary of that, basically what we try to look at in this case is how individuals deal with not only structure and normal constraints, but also challenge a bit this assumption that we are just reacting to structure constraints or constraints we experience without trying to find solutions for ourselves. So basically, you could see that they are trying to deal with these constraints. They are trying to find responses to these constraints. So it's not necessarily that they're subconsciously not adhering to the norms of the everyday investor as assumed by bounded rationality in this case, or that you are limited too much and irrational in this case because you're not behaving accordingly, but you find responses to an unequal welfare system, and you try to move or coordinate within this system. And basically what we kind of put forward as an argument here is that we need to rethink our approaches to rationality. We need to look into how rationality is conceptualized and acknowledge that there are different responses according to subjective life circumstances, but also general multiple rationalities. And these can be very logical within the existing system. And just very briefly, the very preliminary ideas we had based on the insights we gained there is that it would have also to challenge the welfare system more on the aspect that it's a lot of times assumes a gender neutral rationality, but it actually is not. And to integrate these multiple perspectives, to see that it can be very rational to invest in property depending on your life circumstances and not invest in the workplace pension in this case. So rather than focusing on trying to financially educate everyone in a similar line, to look at what is more applicable in one case or the other. And this also relates back to the key aspects I mentioned throughout, that there is an issue with flexibility and accessibility, which might be beneficial in changing the system according to make it more applicable to other life circumstances. And here, in particular, the continuous changes and not ever being sure if not only the regulation stays the same, but also if the employment is secure, that has an impact to everyone. So in order to build more trust in the future, there needs to be more transparency in this case as well. So that's basically the key insights I wanted to discuss today. I'm not sure how I'm with the time, but thank you very much for listening.